So welcome everyone. I'm so happy to be able to be with you and to have a panel on Latin America. Today is our Berlin Freedom Conference in a very historic location and also very historic place. And I think it's a privilege having here at the stage 3 persons who have fought for freedom with their lives, and some of them with a very high personal cost. So let me introduce you first, Felix Maradiaga. Felix Maradiaga, many of you may know him. He was presidential candidate for Nicaragua. And when he was candidate, he was sent to prison. You were there for 21 months. And her wife and his wife and his team made a great advocacy team and advocacy efforts. And it's so good to have Felix Maradiaga here in Berlin with us, but he's also you have also your academic part. He's founder of the Fundación Libertad in Nicaragua, and he's also president of the Liberal International Network. So he has this human rights activism, political activism, but also academic side. So Felix, I'm so happy that you are with us.
Thank you, Dana.
We have also here Pedro Uruchurtu. We have known each other over the years. Pedro Uruchurtu, he is the person in charge of the international relations of the political party Vente Venezuela from Maria Corina Machado. And Pedro Uruchurtu has also a strong career on academics as a professor of political science. And he is very well known also through his struggle during the time when he was in the Argentinian embassy, which an embassy turned out to be a jail. You were there with a great effort of many countries were able to get away and free with a very risk operation, and now he is here with us, and I would also like to hear about your take on the authoritarian book of Latin America that we are seeing. And nonetheless, we have Oscar Schlenke. He is journalist for the Deutsche Welle, over 15 years covering the news from Caracas to the world. And you also found a foundation who promotes indigenous rights in Venezuela. So as you see, it's a luxury having the three of them. My name is Diana Luna. I am Latin America Policy Advisor of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, and I'm very happy that you take the time to hear a little bit what's happening in Latin America. So I will start with this question. Pedro, we see a lot of what is happening in Venezuela in the headlines. How would you describe the current situation in Venezuela?
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Diana, for having me. I thank you, Naumann Foundation, of course, to the Berlin Freedom Conference. It's an honor to address you during this conference. Well, I was thinking when the title of this conference about the authoritarian book, and I think that when we talk about authoritarianism in Venezuela, I think that was in an early stage, because now I think that things are worse than an authoritarian or a common authoritarian regime as we used to know. And because it's even worse than that. It's a regime that definitely decided to go through a criminal dynamic, a criminal structure that has the country kidnapped. And this is important to understand because it's even worse than authoritarian or a traditional dictatorship that, of course, has these kind of practices, but is also involved with criminal activities, in particular drug trafficking, terrorism, and other things. So when you see this, you see not only a country and a regime that has a problem for all Venezuelans, but also for the entire hemisphere, and of course, even for Europe, as we can speak later for sure. So, I mean, when we try to summarize what's going on in Venezuela, I think that if we try to characterize the regime, as I mentioned, this is a criminal structure, it's a criminal regime, but at the same time, we are seeing like the most important, during these 26 years, we have been facing a lot of opportunities to overcome the regime, to fight against the regime, to fight for freedom and democracy. We have been building this platform, this structure. Since 2 years ago, we have seen, this huge movement that started with the primary election on October 22 of 2023, and today, as of today, And we have been creating a huge movement, citizen movement, that is still resisting. And this is very important because sometimes, people think that, the Venezuelan people is disappointed or is not fighting, but no, Venezuelan people keep fighting, but understanding that this criminal regime, after the election of July 28 last year, decided to show their worst criminal face in terms to repress people, to persecute people, and to practice state terrorism. And this is very, very important to understand how people is now fighting within the country, because people still fighting, keep fighting within the country, but through clandestinity, through a smart organization, and as I mentioned before, with a really important structure, as we can say, that is a legitimate leadership that is not only Maria Corina Machado within the country in clandestinity since 15 months ago, but also our elected and legitimate president, Edmundo González Urrutia, who is in exile in Madrid. We have a strong strategy that is really important to understand, that is a strategy that combines not only internal organization, but with external pressure. And of course, we have a very important leadership, a strategy and organization, a smart organization. And when we see this, definitely we are trying to, at this moment as we speak, to coordinate all possible efforts in order to the international pressure and the internal organization in order to make possible, fractures or possible, and of course to reach a transition to democracy through the crackdowns of the regime. So the first thing to understand, and just for finish this introduction, is that Venezuelan people are still fighting. We have a legitimate leadership. We have a very strong strategy. We have an important organization that is not only within the country, but also includes all diaspora. And the most important thing is that we are ready to go through the transition and to get the control of the country and to go through democracy. And the only obstacle we have today is a criminal regime that decided to stay by force in power, and that the only way to remove that regime from power is using force as well. And that's what we are seeing today. And we can discuss about this later. This is not about, military invasion. That is not, it's very common to see in the discussion. It's about use, strength, because as Maria Corina says, when she recently won the Nobel Peace Prize, peace requires freedom, and freedom requires strength in order to be achieved. And that's the moment in which we are. So this is like a summary of the situation. Then we can discuss a little bit more, and of course about the authoritarians and the authoritarian book that, as I mentioned, in Venezuela in our case was an early stage, and we are in an even worse situation right now.
Wow, we will have some time for the final questions. So if you have something, you already mentioned the role of the U.S., we could come back later. But Felix, I think when he's painting the picture of Venezuela, you see many similarities. In which stage is Nicaragua in this handbook of the authoritarian regimes in your country?
First, let me, on behalf of the World Liberty Congress, reemphasize the honor of being here, and also congratulations to Maria Corina for the Nobel Peace Prize, and for the courage, and to Pedro, my dear friend, who also we both share a similar missions. On the question,
congratulations to you. You became president of the World Liberty Congress. So congratulations, Felix.
Thank you so much. So that's a very important question. Which stage? And I think that in order to respond that, I prepare a quick note on how a playbook looks, and I'll briefly go through the playbook of Nicaragua, and you can just take away Nicaragua and see how this autocrat's playbook actually functions in many parts of the world. In the case of Nicaragua, for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with our history, we had a civil war during the 1980s. In 1990, we had a peace agreement. We had the first democratically elected president of Nicaragua, President Violeta Chamorro, who led a transition from war to peace, from a Marxist state to a democratic state. We had 16 years of democratic transition, and then Ortega came back into power in 2007. And the question is why? How did he do it? Well, the first thing that Ortega did is that he used the cracks of corruption. One of the presidents, Arnoldo Alemán, deeply corrupt, needed protection, and Ortega was part of the opposition. So kleptocracy is one of the main mechanisms of autocrats to erode democracy. And that's what happened in Nicaragua. A political party that was supposed to be a safeguard for democracy had a very corrupt leader that opened the doors for Ortega to come into power. So kleptocracy undermines the rule of law. That's rule number one of autocrats in Latin America. Step number two, divide and conquer. Even with the corrupt pact, the democratic forces could have won the elections in 2006. But the two main democratic forces, both of them liberal parties, Pedro and I are part of the Liberal International, and we witnessed that painful part, that it was impossible for the two factions of the democratically elected forces to join together. They divided, and Ortega won the elections despite the fact that he had the lowest percentage of votes. The two parties together had 62% of the vote. Ortega had 35%. So divide and conquer. It's a fundamental mechanism of the playbook. Also, as part of this playbook, Ortega weaponized polarization. We were discussing at that time issues around reproductive rights. So suddenly Ortega, a hypocrite, a Marxist, a Sandinista, became the voice of the most ultra-conservative movements against the feminists in Nicaragua. And a lot of Catholics or people that were not comfortable with the reforms didn't know what to make of Ortega, that suddenly argued that the feminist movement in Nicaragua were their enemies. So before we heard, and this was back in 2007, before we heard about the anti-woke movement, Ortega actually weaponized polarization, using faith, using fundamental disagreements on society that could be resolved through the democratic process in order to divide and conquer. That's a fundamental component of the playbook. Then he co-opted the economic elite. Ortega, as soon as he came into power, he partnered with the Chinese, and he had a lot of headaches with the private sector because, as you may know, he had expropriated all the most important conglomerates during the first Sandinista regime in the 1980s. So suddenly you saw some of the most important family offices, big conglomerates, actually sitting right next with Ortega, because Ortega was offering the billions of dollars of Venezuelan oil to do business and the billions of dollars of the Chinese. And we saw a private sector. For those of you who want to hear more, we'll speak about this on the main stage in an hour. The private sector plays a fundamental role in defending democracy. When you have the economics elite partnering with the kleptocrats, then we see that erosion. The fifth step of the playbook is winning over security forces. Ortega offered, just as Maduro has done, a lot of benefits outside of the Constitution to the military and to the police, from a simple house on the beach to running companies. So suddenly the military, and we had invested, I say this as former Secretary General of the Defense Ministry, we had invested years and years to train a new military, and Ortega, simply by offering millions of dollars to the generals and to the senior police officers, basically eroded civilian control over the military. 6, disguising autocratic intentions. I came to Europe, 2007, 2008, and no, Ortega is not that bad. He had promised that he's going to be different. Look what he's doing, this and that. So a lot of the things happened under the language of democracy. So the autocrats know how to play the game, and there are many, many naive friends in the West, let me say, despite the alarms
Europe
that we
too, yeah.
In Europe in particular, yes. Support from foreign autocracies. Immediately, when Ortega came into power, he received between 2007 and 2012 $5 billion stolen of the Venezuelan people, and Ortega persuaded the political movements in Nicaragua that this money was not foreign aid. So those $5 billion that were granted by Chavez went directly into a private consortium of the Ortega family. So you imagine what someone can do? At that time, just to give you a number, Nicaragua was a small economy, $1 billion a year. So he received 5 times experts as a private political contribution. Can you imagine? This is a massive. Number 8, I'll be very fast. Democratic apathy of the international community. That is self-explanatory. Number 9, assault of civil society, intellectual life, and the press. he shut down the media, he shut down think tanks, he went after the intellectuals, and that's another part of the playbook. And finally, I'll then capture all information channels through social media.
I think these two, I mean, I agree with all the components that you mentioned, but these two, let's stay with these two. Assault civil society and capture the media channels, because this is what you have seen in Venezuela, Oscar Shlenka. How would you say has been for independent journalism in Venezuela within this authoritarian, handbook?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure. Thank you for the Friedrich Naumann Stiftung and for the Berlin Freedom Conference. I've never considered myself an outspoken journalist. I've always thought of myself as a low-profile reporter from Caracas, and for 15 years, that's what I did. And it's been very difficult. We would, or I would, choose my wording very carefully when I did analysis over Venezuela. And I don't like to think of it as self-censorship, but it was, in a way, self-censorship. For example, I would not call the government a regime or Nicolás Maduro a dictator, but I would also not call him a president, or I would not call it a government. I would call it Nicolás Maduro's administration. And those were little tricks that I did just to keep my work safe in Venezuela, because I thought it was important to keep reporting from Venezuela. I thought that was the most important thing that I could do, is to stay in Venezuela and keep the information going. But independent journalism has been, very, very much attacked in the last 20 years. We've had over 400 media blocked and censored and taken out of the airwaves in the past 20 years. In this year alone, we've had 130 violations of freedom of expression and freedom of the press. We have 18 journalists that are in prison, many more that have been detained and then let out after outcries. Since the elections last year, the government and everybody in public administration left Twitter, for example, but their bots are still there. They are still doing propaganda through Twitter and through social media. So it's been very perverse, the way that we've had to cover the news. And I think one of the most important things that wasn't mentioned in this playbook is the lack of official information. That was the most difficult thing for us as journalists to work with, because we work with balance. We try and be balanced in our information, especially working for Deutsche Welle. We always strive to get both sides. And when you don't have the other side, there has been no official information of what's going on in Venezuela in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of the whole administration economy. And that really poses a threat not only to our work as a journalist, because how are we going to compare to reality? Or how are we going to say it's a lie if there's no information? And I think that is part of the playbook that is being even taken into account now in democratic governments, when they start dismantling their own official data analysis of how the government is going. And the thing that worried us as journalists the most is not that they're not disclosing this information and that they're not giving interviews to the private media, is that we don't even know if they are actually lifting that information. We don't know if those numbers are actually being investigated. It would be great if it were, because then we know that they're working with numbers to probably solve some situation or the problems that we're having in Venezuela. But we don't think there even are those investigations going on, which is very problematic for a government if there's a regime change. Well, it's not that problematic if you think you have to build everything from the ground up, but it would be nice to have that data so that we can know where we're walking into, because it's like a blind man in a dark room. You really don't know what you're going to find. So those are the issues that we had to tackle as journalists. And that's how I became also involved with NGOs, because a lot of my colleagues say, well, a journalist shouldn't be an activist. But in these governments, in these authoritarian governments, like in Nicaragua or in Venezuela or in other governments that we've seen, they push journalists to be activists. We become activists for the truth. And we have to act upon it. And I became involved with NGOs because I needed data to balance my information. I needed data to say, look, this is what we're seeing, this is what this NGO has lifted as information. And then I started my NGO and I started working with indigenous people just because I think those are the most vulnerable communities in Venezuela right now. But yeah, that's been the struggle with doing journalism in independent journalism in Venezuela, is getting the information besides all the persecution and difficulties that we've heard from other regimes. That it's part of the same playbook.
Thank you, Oscar. I will just make a second question because I want to give the audience the chance to raise questions. But we are here in Berlin, and you guys have mentioned the role of US, but let's start with the role of Europe. As you mentioned, Felix, there is this nostalgia, this love for the Sandinist revolution, some of even from the Chavista revolution. Things have changed since that, but we have seen the role of the European Union quite passive regarding sanctions, regarding the support for the democratic transition, which already was decided on July the 28th. At the same time, I always said that for geopolitical reasons, Venezuela is extremely important for Europe. Could you say why will the crisis in Nicaragua and Venezuela matters to Europe? How will you explain that, for instance, an official, but also a normal citizen? Why is that important for Europe? So if you want to start, Pedro?
Yeah, perfect. I mean, going back to the handbook, I think that there are three more things that we can highlight. That is, the first is the weakening of the justice system, because that in Venezuela was one of the first things that happened. Removing independent judges and appointing, political judges. That's very crucial for the regime in order to advance in their policies and the things they did in that stage. And I think that about what you mentioned is the use, the transversal use of fear and terror. And I have one simple example. A few weeks ago, Maria Corina was awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize, and nobody in Venezuela could celebrate this prize. That was impossible to do this, because people feel fear about to post something on social media. So that's the kind of things that you see as a Nobel Prize in every country should be like a huge way to celebrate, join us, and this didn't happen in Venezuela. So that's the kind of things that we are seeing. And I want to highlight as well the role of the civil society from the very beginning in the Venezuelan Chavista regime, because one of the first huge demonstrations we had was precisely mothers defending her sons and children in terms to against the idealization of the education. And that's the kind of things that since the very beginning we have seen in a very important role of the civil society in Venezuela. And I think that is very important to support the role of civil society, not only to documentation and about these things in order to defend truth, but also because at the end, I think that now we are and still resisting thanks to the civil society that keep fighting in Venezuela, even in clandestinity, for those who remain there. So I think it's really, really important. Going back to the role of Europe, I think that sometimes it's quite frustrating because it's not, I think that they have a lot of information. They have all the things that are going on in Venezuela. There's no doubt about that. We won an election. We got a legitimate president. We demonstrate the victory. And even with that, you see that even some people, some governments doubt about, the current process, or about even call for a dialogue or even worse than that, a negotiation that, in fact, in our experience, has been dialogue, not real negotiation. And as we have said, the only negotiation we can accept is that could talk about leaving power from the regime side. No more than that. We cannot accept other thing than that. So one of the meetings that I have been having with some officials here in Europe, it's very important to understand, for instance, if you want to get one topic that could be related through Latin America and Europe, is Russia. Why we cannot speak even more about the role of Russia in Latin America? Because in Nicaragua has become like probably the main military point of influence, military influence of Russia in Central America and probably in Latin America, even more than Venezuela. But there is military cooperation between Venezuela and Russia, and it's really hard to see how in the officials in the European Union we don't see this kind of, links between these kind of alliances. So I think that, the reality, it is what it is. We cannot, as Ayn Rand said, you can ignore reality, but you cannot ignore the consequences of ignore reality. And the thing is that now we are in a break point. I think Venezuela is in the crossroads, and what we are demanding is simply to support the mandate of a legitimate government that was elected by people. That was a regime change that was mandated last year. But yes, we are confronting and we are facing a criminal structure, a criminal mafia. And the only way to go through this way is to dismantle this criminal regime. So yes, we need to support this in a more effective way. We need to advance on this and yes, push more sanctions, of course, more pressure, because it's the only way these bad guys understand that they have to leave. And that's the only thing we can accept. The only things that we can accept and we can push right now is to these guys leave power.
Thank you. Thank you, Pedro. Thank you for those clear words. Felix, we are mentioning Nicaragua has turned the most important point of military cooperation, let's call it, from Russia in Nicaragua. Why this should matter to Europe?
It should matter to Europe because it's a direct cooperation with a regime that is threatening the stability and the peace of Europe. And as president of the World Liberty Congress, I also need to speak on behalf of Cuba. Yeah. Cuba, as a concrete example, so it's not only Nicaragua. In fact, the largest military, I would call it a base, although from a branding point of view, they say this is a police training center in Nicaragua with satellites and so on. We all know it's actually a Russian military base. But actually, the Cuban regime is sending between 3,000 and 5,000 Cuban soldiers to fight alongside the Russians in the illegal invasion of Ukraine. And yet you see the European Union sending money, development money to Cuba. That's completely irrational. How can you use taxpayers' money from European citizens to send to Cuba, which is a regime that is going against the safety and the peace of European states? So that's clearly a point, and I would like to hear some of the questions of the audience. So I will end up basically by saying this. The European mindset is deeply respectful of sovereignty. And that's built upon the arrangements of a post-Cold War in which we all thought, and designers of such international architecture thought, that all countries will use their sovereign rights to protect their people. But under the excuse of sovereignty, you have Venezuela partnered with Iran. Under the excuse of sovereignty, you have the Cubans sending soldiers to Russia. Under the excuse of sovereignty, Daniel Ortega is granting Nicaraguan passport to terrorists and Nicaraguan passports to human traffickers, and using the Nicaraguan airspace to bring people from all around the world to basically charge human traffickers money and exploit those migrants who want to go to the US using the Nicaraguan path. So I think that we need to rethink not sovereignty, but the whole infrastructure of diplomacy, because the autocrats, particularly China, Russia, and Iran, are basically playing the system.
Thank you. Thank you also for that clear message. Oscar Schlenke, how do you explain the people in Europe, at the Deutsche Welle, about the strongest military equipment in Southern Caribbean? How do you explain the situation? What will be your assessment on that?
Well, first,
and what can Europe do that also? Why does it matter to Europe?
Yeah, I wanted to answer the question as well, because I think that part of that handbook originates from Russia, and there's a big threat here in Europe from Russia, and we have seen it as well in legislature that has been used to attack civil society in Venezuela. It's a copy-paste from legislature from Russia as well. But we also cannot undermine the ability for this handbook to innovate and to adapt to the countries. And they want you to to feel like they are beatable. They like to be the underdog. So you underestimate these regimes. And they play with that. They play on that and with that. In regards to the military operation in the Caribbean, I think it's difficult to analyze it from a journalistic perspective because you do have to be balanced. But at the same time, there's an amount of narratives that are being pushed through that story that don't completely tell the whole story. We have investigative journalists in Venezuela working for years now, talking about how the criminal organizations and narco drug traffickers have completely taken over towns and districts in states in the Venezuelan coast. They have reported that these boats that are being taken down by the US government, that they have been transporting drugs. But the news reports always say, well, there wasn't any evidence. There has been evidence also by the Dominican Republic and by Trinidad and Tobago, and there's this whole support of the Caribbean in these operations. Now, I think the narrative should also criticize that there is obviously the amount of force being used into these operations is exaggerated. And of course, there are people there that maybe it was their first trip on these boats, that maybe they didn't have such a lengthy activity with drug trafficking, but also AP just released a story this week talking about a little bit of some of the victims of some of the people that were taken down in these boats. One of them was a renowned drug trafficker that in 2020 lost his 2 sons and grandchildren in one of the boats that capsized. They were human trafficking. It's not only about drug trafficking, it's also human trafficking. It's also illegal mining that's going through these routes. And they are very, they do a lot of damage to these communities. You know, it's just a mixed bag of narratives that we have to pick and choose, you know, how we report on them.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, because the picture is that complex. So I will leave now room for questions and answers from you guys, from the audience. Please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and ask your question. And you say to whom is the question. Someone want to start with a question? Yeah, please. I'll bring you the microphone.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Stefan from Peru. I was wondering, for Pedro, a question. If you feel that Mercosur has made enough pressure for Venezuela, given the instability of mass migration. I'm quite familiar with Venezuelan suffering. I come from Peru. But I am a little bit disappointed of how Mercosur is handling such a situation. Now you mentioned illegal mining, which is also a threat for all the region. But I don't know if from your perspective, you are sensing some development in Mercosur pressure or dynamics as a political continent. Thank you.
I think I will, if there's more questions, maybe we can pick three. Pick two, one more, okay? Please.
Yes, I want to hear more about Luis Carlos from Venezuela. I want to hear more about the pro-Russia movement in Europe, in the far right and the far left, who are washing Maduro in this moment, only because they are criticized Trump. So in the anti-Trump discourse, so maybe they are doing the Maduro is a clean president or legitimate president. How can you see that?
So we have two questions. Who wants to start with the one on Mercosur?
Yeah, I think, well, Mercosur, was created as from an economical way to think the region and particularly South America. And I think that Chavez was who decided to politicize the Mercosur. And at the end of that I think that in a certain way helped us some years ago when they decided to suspend Venezuela for violating the democratic principles of the Mercosur Charter. So I think that, yes, probably that was like an obsession of Hugo Chavez to make Venezuela a member of Mercosur. He pushed on that in that way, and at the end, they supported human rights and the fighting for democracy in Venezuela when they decided to suspend our country. I think it was less 10 years ago or something, 8 years ago. So yeah, I mean, we have now, let's see with Bolivia, I think that the change in Bolivia is very important because Bolivia is a full member of Mercosur. I think that will influence in a very good way, in addition with Argentina and Paraguay that are really good allies of the cause. Let's see about Uruguay, that, there's more center left at this moment, but at the end there's a very democratic country, and I think they are very supportive on human rights and defense of democracy. But definitely we need to see the role of Brazil, that we expect more from them, because to be honest, it has been really disappointing. Even because it's a huge actor, it's a very important actor in the region. So we expect more from not only Mercosur, but from the region, definitely. But I'm optimistic about the inclusion of this democratic government in Bolivia, and definitely even in the case of the transition to democracy in Venezuela, Venezuela will be more than able to have a good relationship with Mercosur. I don't know if now is a decision to come back. I don't know if there is the space that we need to be, but definitely we are ready for have good relationships as a democracy.
Felix?
Thank you for your question, Luis Carlos. It's a super important question. And I think that if Russia indeed doesn't have the financial resources to be this superpower that will create a new world order, they do have the know-how. And the Chinese are putting the resources. We're seeing in many, many parts of the world that when you see these disinformation campaigns, you see a close collaboration between the Chinese resources in terms of technology and the Russian know-how. And this is all going again with the analogy of the playbook. It's a playbook of the KGB. And let me give you concrete examples. When Putin came into power, one of the first things he did in Latin America, he basically recruited the intellectuals, the think tanks, the academics who used to be the mouthpieces of the Soviet Union. And many of them were in prestigious universities in Brazil, in Colombia, in Mexico. And suddenly you saw these centers talking about the rebirth of a new Russia and so on. And you have seen how there's a migration of these centers, but also with social media, you can also track the trolls that a decade ago, and there's some funny stories. You see a troll with a far-left narrative, they just change the name, and then you see thousands of trolls using the far-right narrative in a particular country. Then those same trolls move to a different debate within social media, and suddenly they are acquiring a progressive narrative. Because what they're trying to use is polarization. And in the case of Latin America, I will say this very openly, I'm a man of faith, I'm a Catholic, I will be a conservative in the playbook of many people. I'm actually a classical liberal. But I think that the worst thing that we can do is fall into the trap of polarization, because polarization erodes the capacity of decision makers to be objective when they do public policy, but also erodes our common humanity. So the Russians in Nicaragua advised Ortega to suddenly acquire an ultra-conservative Catholic narrative, because that worked for Ortega. But if you follow the same advisors, when they go to Mexico, they basically are using the Gaza issue in Mexico to erode the capacity of civil society to have common ground. The Russians are working in such a sophisticated way that it's scary. How can we fight back? Of course, we're talking about Latin America, but I think it applies to all of us. We have to work very, very hard on building a big tent from civil society. We have to work very hard from politics in finding common ground, because the radical thing that you can do right now is actually be a moderate. When you see a radical rhetoric, it's not because someone actually believes that. In fact, I think that the far-right narrative in Latin America has nothing to do with religion. It's basically just the typical manipulation. And that's what we're trying to do at the World Liberty Congress, creating common ground and a big tent.
Very good. Thank you, Felix.
And if I can...
Yes,
add
Pedro and
something,
Oscar.
about the authoritarian handbook, I think that even we need a playbook, we need to add one thing that is transversal at this moment, that is transnational repression. Because this is a very huge thing that we are seeing, not only, I mean, of course, in Nicaragua and in Costa Rica and other countries, but we are seeing this as a real big problem. And it's a problem, I mean, because they work in network. So definitely that's now we can talk about a playbook, transversal playbook of authoritarians, not only through cases of Venezuela or Nicaragua or Cuba, but we need to discuss about this in a deeper way, because definitely it's probably one of the most important challenges that activists from around the world are facing at this moment.
Oscar, you want to say something also on?
Well, I just want to chime in that I think this playbook goes beyond ideologies. I mean, it goes to the extremes. I think being a moderate is radical right now, and it should be, and that's a problem, because that's where we find balance in trying to say and have credibility, which is one of the biggest problems we have as journalists today. But this handbook, I've gone to some of the protests and demonstrations here, and I leave confused.
Why?
We have seen that, for example, in Venezuela, one of the communities that has no rights is the LGBT community, the indigenous rights, and these are flag issues that the left uses, but then they're not present in the right. But then they, sometimes they mix, and it's hard to explain where we're at in Venezuela with human rights for civil society, because many people just don't understand it. How can this be? But I think that's part of the mission, is to have a unified narrative. And because that's what we're playing in today, to gather support from different audiences, is just to have a good narrative for it.
Thank you. Well, we have a final round of questions. Maybe is there someone? Yeah, there. Yeah, you don't need one. Okay. Well, could you say your name and your foundation and?
Roberto Perez Rocha, Mexican, I work at Transparency International. It's a network that fights corruption all over the world. So talking about the Big Tent and the building coalitions, so on and so forth, I was pretty surprised that the Summit of the Americas was postponed. Of course, in the news, you would see a lot of bashing and trashing between countries. And it was clear that everybody might be fighting during the Summit of the Americas. But I would love to hear your take about what happened and what may happen if the next summit happens in 2026.
Thank you. That's a great question. Someone else? Any woman? We haven't had any woman asking anything.
Thank you. My name is Erik Jeners. I'm from Civil Rights Defenders in Stockholm. And thank you very much for these very clear-sighted analysis of Venezuela and Nicaragua. But I would like to ask you how you see El Salvador in this playbook of authoritarianism that we are so clearly experiencing at this very moment. Because clearly El Salvador is going maybe a different, but also a very authoritarian path at the moment.
We have also hybrids, regimes. A last question to finish? They're great.
Hello, hi, I'm Isabella. I'm from Honduras. I'm a student. And similar to the question he just asked, I would like to have your opinion on Honduras, especially right now that soon we're having our elections. And it's very tight, as you probably already know, with the left.
So we have Summit of Americas, we have El Salvador and Honduras. Who want to start? Yeah, Felix.
I will start with Honduras. We are, at the World Liberty Congress, one of the few organizations that actually gets very sad when we have a new member and get very happy when someone leaves the organization. So we are in the preparation of transition of Bolivia that had an election. It was a fair and free election, and actually I need to give public credit to Yanis Dazawaca, member of the World Liberty Congress, who conduct an extraordinary mission of observation and facilitation without having any involvement with any of the factions, simply providing the fundamental support of how do you observe free and fair elections. And but then we had a request from Honduras. And there were delegates from Honduras, potential delegates from Honduras, who presented the case in which Xiomara Castro is actually eroding the electoral process. The World Liberty Congress has been invited to observe the elections. It will be my first international trip on November 30 to Honduras to observe the elections. I have already received a formal accreditation, by the way, so I announced that we already received accreditation to go to Honduras. We're also going to have a mission of the Red Liberal, the America Latina, and we're deeply concerned. At this point, we don't even know if the elections will take place. And in the case of Honduras, if you go to the playbook, it's actually a classical case of kleptocracy and how organized crime, and particularly the interests of drug traffickers, are mixed with the military and also with the current government. I hope that I could be proven wrong. And the two particular parties, the Conservative Party of Honduras, that had, as you know, a very controversial situation with Juan Orlando, and Mr. Nasrallah, that now represents actually the Liberal Party. And I would like to acknowledge the Nauman Foundation that is doing a spectacular work in Honduras through your mission from Mexico.
Not with the party.
Not with the party, but you're doing work with Honduras, with civil society. So we expect that we can be proven wrong and that there are going to be a free and fair elections. If I have to guess, I think that will not be the case. And the only way to avoid that is actually to follow the lesson learned from Bolivia. Bolivia was inundated with observers. It was inundated with international community. And of course, the mass of Bolivia didn't want free and fair elections, but when they had the eye of the world, things changed. Regarding the Summit of the Americas, I think that the lesson learned there is that the OAS, although the Summit of the Americas goes beyond the OAS, but the inter-American system has no teeth. As we say in Spanish, no tiene dientes. And when you have a spectacular platform, if you read the Charter of the Americas of September 2001, that was approved in Lima, it was expected that the Latin American countries were actually going to take charge of inter-American affairs. So when someone wants to criticize the weight of the U.S. in Latin America, my question is, where is Mexico? Sure. My question is, where is Colombia? Where is Brazil? Where is Chile? Although Chile would say it's doing interesting work. So the lack of multilateral action in Latin America is because we have an erosion of the credibility of the inter-American system. If you want to see something different, we need to rethink the inter-American system.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Oscar, you want to say something on El Salvador?
Yeah, definitely. I think when I said that the handbook plays just as well on the right and on the left, you know, El Salvador is an example of that. I've had colleagues that have had to leave El Salvador because of persecution from the government there. And I think there's a shift in the whole Latin America towards these governments that are pushing for more security. And it's successful. There are successful things from this handbook that many governments are taking, you know, things that they might find useful for their governance. It's true we have a big problem in South America of security. And that the handbook mixed with this narrative of we're going to give you security does win elections. And we are seeing that shift in Latin America. And I think that shift also answers to the question about the America Summit. There is a division in Latin America going on right now. We're seeing it right now in the CELAC EU Summit in Santa Marta. Nobody went, or well, some people went, but it was just not very well attended. We're seeing it also in the COP conference in Brazil right now as well. So this is undermining issues that we need in Latin America as well. We need to have a common ground, for example, for climate change and for human rights that we need as well in the region. From both sides, from the right and the left, we're seeing also a big human rights violation going on in the United States with all the immigrants that are being deported in a very crude and inhumane way. And we have to advocate for that as well. But yeah, it's a tough job for politicians because they have to stay true to their message and conviction, but it's even harder for journalists to try and pick and choose, you know, how are we going to report this? How are we going to say the truth and still keep the human aspect of it that's so important for us to validate and have credibility on what we're talking about?
Thank you. Pedro, will you have a final remark?
Yeah, about the summit, I think that, well, multilateralism is in crisis. It's obvious. And I think that a lot of governments prefer not to attend multilateral events because probably they don't find there's something important. And that's kind of reflection we have to do about the role of these organizations. And I think that even to postpone the summit is a good idea in terms to reflect for what we are doing this summit in this moment. Of course, it's important to exclude, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela regimes, but it's more than that. It's about, I think that's it's about values and what the kind of values we are defending in these organizations. And I think it's a big opportunity. And I have to say that the good thing that postponed the summit is that probably we will have the legitimate government seated in that next summit next year.
Well, we hope also for the democratic transition in Venezuela.
Venezuela will be there.
Thank you, everyone, for coming here. Muchas gracias.